Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I did promise you more regular uploads and more regular streams. I'm definitely, for now, I'm definitely keeping that up. There is not that much hard news, though, admittedly. Though two new pieces that are kind of part of one big report have dropped, and I really want to talk about. Beyond all that, there's also obviously MKBHD's phone of the year review video, which I would like to react to. We have Rose already joining the chat. Hello to anyone finding the video live or joining later on in the form of a VOD, or of course however else you choose to engage with us here, whether it's through Discord, Twitter, it's all much appreciated. I hope you enjoy it. As always, leave suggestions what else you would like to see me react to and comment on. And beyond all that, you can, of course, support me directly via Super Chats, Super Stickers, Patreon subscriptions, channel memberships, right here on YouTube's. All of it is very much appreciated. I apologize for starting a few minutes later. I just came home, basically had a few minutes to freshen up, so maybe I should have planned the stream for like 7 p.m. flat, but here I am. And yes, let's make myself a little bit smaller here again, a little bit more subtlety on the screen. We do have obviously more Apple hardware to talk about. How else could it be, given the fact that we have not gotten the hardware releases that we like believed we would actually get by the end of the year. Obviously, we are still waiting for the HomePod Mini 2. We are still waiting for AirTag 2. By the way, we already have the U2 processor, right? That ultra wideband second generation chip that supports wider distances, better precision, all that jazz, right? That's already in Apple devices. We still aren't getting AirTag. HomePod, that's supposed to be getting an Apple N1 chip. Obviously, the entire iPhone 17 generation just got N1 chips. The new M5 iPad Pro got N1 chips. Nothing about that. New Apple TV. We obviously already have the A17 chip. The old Apple TV is getting a little bit old in the tooth. It's still the very best device in its product category. Like, nothing comes close to having an A15 level processor. But I would like at least 6 gigs of RAM, preferably something like 8 and stuff like that, right? Obviously, like, just in general, I know that these products are not as in demand as iPhones and iPads and Macs. So it kind of tends to be forgotten, but that's what we have talked a lot about before December hit. We definitely expected that by the time we get to the holiday season, those devices would basically be ready to be put under the Christmas tree. Whatever other holiday you may celebrate, right? That being said, there are obviously also other products that we expect for early next year. Now, they are not as crazy delayed as it seems as when we are talking about the HomePod and AirTag and stuff like that. But they are also still a tiny bit overdue, I would argue, especially the iPad mini. Needs a little bit of an update. What's very interesting though is supposedly the base level iPad might be getting a very, very interesting update. So we're going to talk a lot about that. And there's also talk about an Apple Studio Display upgrade, which even Mark Gurman, now Mark Gurman has not commented on it that recently, but also not too long ago, thankfully. And he basically said that it would be coming out with a wave of new Mac hardware, right? So talking M5 Pro, M5 Max MacBook Pro, M5 MacBook Air, right? We obviously already have the M5 MacBook Pro, but then the question even is if the next Apple Studio Display supports 5K or 6K at 120 hertz. Will it need Thunderbolt 5 for that? So will it only be restricted to the Pro models that can access all its functionality? Will using display stream compression allow Thunderbolt 4 Max to access 120 hertz, maybe at a lower bit rate? So Unfortunately, none of that is answered too directly, but we are getting pretty interesting technological details that I quite honestly did not expect to be getting. And that's why I'm streaming today. And I apologize for only now kind of getting in the groove, adding some energy, because as I said, I just very, very quickly set my studio up here again and got started. So, basically, unlike most streams, I think I've had one stream like this in like the last 3 months or so. These are rumors coming from Mac World. So obviously you guys know we are usually using stuff like 95 Mac rumors, and even then most leaks are there don't originate there. Some do, especially 95 Mac has a few leaks from time to time. Obviously they mostly summarize other leaks. I mean, that's also what Macworld does, but they are the biggest websites when it comes to like Apple leaks and rumors. Obviously, we react to stuff from Mark Gurman from Bloomberg. We reacted to an entire article of his last time. Oh, by the way, I should be. I should kind of preface this video. Johnny Srouji comment Apple Mac rumors. Because this was a big article that we reacted to last time, which was Mark Gurman basically alluding to the fact that Johnny Srouji, Apple's chief hardware engineer, sorry, not engineer, because that's technically Mark Turnus's expertise. He is the chief of hardware technologies, or senior vice president of hardware technologies. He's primarily responsible for Apple Silicon. With Apple Silicon, though, he's not just responsible for A series chips, but also M series chips, R series chips, and now C modems, N modems. So there's a lot on his plate, obviously. And we heard, oh, he might leave Apple. And look, you might like Alan Dye. Like, I personally am a big fan of Liquid Glass. I think that under him, there's definitely a tiny bit less attention to detail as might have been in the past, but I have mostly blamed that honestly on Apple having so much more on their plate. I think that's something that people really, really ignore. Like, back in the day when, like, the days that, like, John Gruber remembers, right? Like, when he talks about the transition to Aqua design, right? Around the turn of the century, turn of the millennium, actually, right? Or even macOS Line, Mountain Line, all that stuff, right? There was very little on Apple's plate. Sure, Apple started to get like the iPhone on their plate, and they did iPods, but iPods were mostly a vehicle for music. It's not like they had the most elaborate operating systems with the most lavish of designs and stuff like that. But like, yeah, like nowadays Apple doesn't just have iPhone, but they have literally iPhones. They have iPhones of different sizes. They have iPhones with different kind of processors, supporting iPhones as old as 7 years or so. That's what they need to do. The same thing with iPads, often supporting even longer sometimes there than iPhones. And obviously iPadOS has been getting more functionality to differentiate itself from iOS and bring it closer to macOS. But in that approach, Apple also is giving iPadOS more unique features like Stage Manager versus the standard multitasking user interface that we got on Mac. And then obviously over time, stuff like that also gets ported to macOS. That's why I can be using Stage Manager while streaming on my Mac, right? And that's just like, then you have the Apple Watch, which for all like its simplicity, its operating system is way more complex than on anything other than the iPod Touch. And the iPod Touch was basically just a clone of whatever iPhone was out at the time. Just slimmer, lighter, less cooling, less battery, no cellular modem, right? Worse cameras. So in that way, it's not really a clone, but it had the same size screen and usually a pretty up-to-date processor. And yeah, that's why it could run all the basics basically the same way. nowadays even tvOS has matured a lot, has gotten more complex features. Obviously macOS has grown and now has grown more in importance again thanks to Apple Silicon. I would argue ever since like the Vista days, where Apple was able to poach a lot of users from Microsoft and Windows. Like Mac was not as important during 2013 to like 2018, I would argue. And then by 2019, a lot of people were like, oh, we kind of heard about the transition happening and stuff like that. Obviously, then Apple confirms it. And that now we have Apple Silicon. That's a new branch of Macs to support. Now x86 Macs are losing their support. Thankfully, that's going to make software development a lot easier in the future. But that's still a huge, huge transition. So you can take it however you want. Like, obviously, whatever Apple is doing, they must deliver a good product. They definitely ask enough money for us to be demanding that, but here and there, like the raw attention to detail will suffer a bit from just having to juggle a lot more. Obviously, that's a little bit of more of a side rant. It has nothing to do with Johnny Srouji. But when it comes to Alan Dye, yeah, you can like him, you can dislike him. But I think we can all agree that Alan Dye leaving is ultimately not going to be a huge loss for Apple, right? Apple's design teams are top-notch. There are people there that have been even longer at Apple than Alan Dye. And obviously, Alan Dye leaving for Meta kind of puts a bad taste in your mouth, kind of gives you less appreciation for him in a way. But even more importantly, sorry, I had to answer a message. Even more importantly, there are executives at Apple that are not easy to replace right now, right? Mark I tried to replace at least one of the John names. Apple has just so many Johns. John Turnus right now would be very difficult to replace, not only because he oversees a lot of projects as the Senior Vice President of Hardware Engineering, but he's currently being groomed to be Apple's next CEO. Craig Federighi, not only overseeing all of the major operating systems and other pieces of software, but now getting even more onto his shoulders with the transition from John Giandrea away from Apple, and the new guy responsible for AI at Apple, whose name I'm sorry, I just cannot remember. He now responds directly to Craig Federighi, who then responds to Tim Cook, right? So Craig has more on his plate. Previously, the AI team was somewhat separate. Now Craig has to oversee all that. And I would argue Johnny Srouji. Now, Johnny Srouji has two incredibly talented lieutenants at the company, right? People who I'm sure once he actually retires will be very, very capable of taking over. Who knows, by the time like he leaves, Apple's hardware efforts will have become so huge that Apple might need two co-leads of like just chip design and stuff like that. Like, think about it. Like, if your expertise is in modems, like, and you might be the very best at it, it might just make more sense to give you like your own division to be working on Apple C chips, N chips, U chips even, right? Then having you to also oversee A chips and M chips. So there is a lot that can happen, and I'm not saying that, look, anything can happen. If Johnny Srouji fell under a bus tomorrow, right, that would be a tremendous loss for Apple. But he would be ultimately replaceable. What I do not want to happen right now, and it's something that I think the likes of Mark Gurman has been pushing, is this idea that Apple, like, piece by piece, like just everyone will leave in the Tim Cook transition. Nobody knows if they should stay or not, and blah, 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 panic mode, right? That's what I don't want from the likes of Johnny Srouji, because, like, let's be honest, we know that Johnny Srouji will be safe, right? Whether or not he actually went to Tim Cook and told him he's thinking of retiring, and if he is retiring, he might not actually retire, but actually go to another company, right? That was the one report, mind you, by Mark Gurman. It was not corroborated by anyone. I think not even John Gruber has come out to say that any of his sources said anything about that, right? Okay, but let's even take it at face value that this happened. Does it have to be the truth? Not really. It could also just be a power play from Johnny, right? Saying, look, I want a bigger pay package. I want stocks. I would obviously, even if Apple stocks don't increase in value too much, they are still very valuable right now, and they will be very valuable in 5 years. And more importantly, like, they will also make dividends on top of that. So if he got like a pay package potentially for like the next 5 years, let's say until he gets into retirement age, right now he's 61, let's say until 65, 66, 67. I don't think that Apple can conceivably force him to work until he's 70 and beyond or something like that, right? But I do think that for the next 5 years, it would be very nice for him to stay. And seemingly, at least for the near future, or however else you want to define his comment, Johnny Srouji is staying. And this is why I do really dislike a lot of the recent coverage by Mark Gurman. It's not just his outrageous comments bringing up the tremor or whatever that Tim Cook supposedly has, right? And again, I'm bringing this up not for views or anything. I'm bringing this up to attack it, right? That's a very different kinds of coverage. Mark Gurman put that into the ether, and I'm just breathing that ether in and responding to it. I'm not in any way saying this is believable or that this should even be discussed in the sense that, oh, but maybe it's true, so we should be preparing for it, right? But with Johnny Srouji, the situation was much more clear-cut. And he's saying the following, right? In fact, this was so important that he did not just address his own team by saying, I love my team, I love my job at Apple, and I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. Now, I've seen some people basically focus on the anytime soon, that technically that doesn't debunk some of the stuff that Gurman said. But again, this is a 61-year-old man. Like, he's aware that at some point he is gonna leave. He's not a 25-year-old who thinks that life is endless in a way, right? I'm 29 and I don't think that, but even I probably am less aware of my mortality and my need to eventually retire and stuff like that. But yeah, he's saying anytime soon because of course he's gonna leave, probably in the next decade, very likely, and maybe even in the next 5 years. And I have nothing against that if that happens. I think that honestly, extremely talented people like this probably should work longer. It's very good actually for the brain, but they should be taking lesser hours, right? Like, you don't, if you are working 10, 12 hours a day potentially, and even into the weekends, by the time you're 65 or something like that, you really should be reducing that burden. It will be better actually for everyone. Your brain will be much more functional, much more rested. You'll probably be in a better mood. That's something your team will appreciate. Johnny Srouji is notoriously no nonsense. He's not cruel. There are no stories like that, but he's definitely look, you're working under me, so you're very talented, and I expect very, very good results. And this is he's also saying obtained by Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. I think that Apple deliberately shared this. So this sounds like Gurman might be doing some hardcore investigative journalism. That's not my impression of the situation, but let's actually read that, and then we can go into the stories that actually have a little bit of Apple silicon on the side. Here's Srouji's full memo. I know you've been reading all kinds of rumors and speculations about my future at Apple, and I feel that you need to hear from me directly. I am proud of the amazing technologies we all built across displays, cameras, sensors, silicon, batteries, and a very wide set of technologies. So importantly, he is the Senior Vice President of Hardware Technology. So even though he is the Apple Silicon guy, technically he is also the guy that signs off on whatever Apple puts out in terms of cameras and displays and batteries, right? That doesn't mean that obviously his own expertise will be specifically the development of each of those technologies. Like, for example, Apple's camera team is notorious for being super duper large, right? Even though one might argue sometimes, like from the iPhone 14 Pro Max to now the 17 Pro Max, we have basically had the same main camera setup, right? They definitely could be working a little faster in that regard, but obviously there are money questions, like how much more money does a new solution cost? For example, the next iPhone 18 Pro is rumored to be getting a variable aperture design. Obviously, in the meantime, we have gotten better sensor on the front-facing camera and on the zoom camera, and the zoom camera has actually got numerous optical changes from 3x to 5x to now 4x, but with a much larger, higher resolution sensor that allows you up to 8x zoom. So all of that is technically under Johnny Srouji, and then John Turnus, so many Johns, and then John Turnus oversees how these technologies come together in a final product. That's why he is the chief of hardware engineering. Now, one of the running rumors, at least one of the suggestions that Gurman has speculated on, that what could be happening to keep Johnny Srouji at Apple would be to merge those two things, with hardware technologies and hardware engineering. In fact, most companies do not have that kind of division. For Apple, honestly, it makes sense just because how large Apple is. You could even argue you could have a senior vice president of just Apple Silicon, given how big and how important Apple Silicon has become inside Apple. But basically, once John Turnus becomes CEO, which is very likely at this point, there are no other alternatives that are being floated, neither by Gurman or Gruber or Min-Chi Kuo. It seems like he's pretty much the only guy they're eyeing. Like, I do think they probably have some emergency idea, because again, you never know who might walk under, who might be hit by a bus tomorrow or something like that. Like Craig is 54, like he is just 4 or 5 years older than John Turnus. If absolutely need be, I think he would take over, but I don't think that that is Apple's number one or even number two plan. But when it comes, and I think that Johnny Srouji, given that we kind of are getting to understand it, he might be very ambitious, but that being said, he obviously thought it was more lucrative and more ambitious for him personally to stay at Apple in 2021 when he was being offered the position of the new Intel CEO, right? So definitely working at Apple, even as a senior vice president, not a CEO, not a COO, right? And even just one of two vice presidents of hardware, right? That to him was more respectable than working as the potential CEO at Intel, right? At Intel, he would then oversee as CEO not just chip design, but also foundry stuff. Now, obviously, Intel was not in the greatest position back then, nor are they really now. But that was in the midst of the Mac Apple Silicon transition, right? Still very early on. Very happy he obviously stayed on for this. But yeah, this idea that he might just willy-nilly change to some other company for a paycheck, like potentially the way, like even Alan Dye, by the way, a lot of people are just reducing and saying, oh, Apple needs to double the pay packages for everyone. Alan Dye did not leave to Meta just because Meta offered him a big pile of cash. Alan Dye left because he's going to be design king at Meta. He will be responsible for software design, but also most likely have a ton of impact on hardware design. He gets to hire whomever he wishes. He gets to work on Meta's next glasses, which is funny because now we have like Meta glasses, like the next generation in 2027. So we are getting new Google glasses, but they are very, very different from the original Google Glass, coming already next year. We're supposedly looking at some Apple solution in 2028. And obviously by that time, you're also looking at like a second generation potentially from Google or something like that. So there is a lot of augmented reality stuff. Yet I still don't see the necessary technology for that being ready. Like, just looking at this picture of Johnny Srouji, right? Like, look at how thin his glasses are, which are the glasses of most people. Okay, so let's say here at the corner you could conceivably put a camera. Let's say you make the frame here a little bit thicker for some battery. Maybe on the other side you make room for a processor. And that's it, honestly. Like, when it comes to other sensors, the way that Apple Vision Pro uses LiDAR sensors and everything else, like, again, this is a very, very different discussion from what we started having. I apologize for being a little bit ranty today. But yeah, definitely, like, there are a lot of reasons for Alan Dye to leave, because there's a lot of room for him to grow. Well, he's already now at the top of meta design, while at Apple he was stuck at the head of human interface design. He was not gonna take over for hardware design too. He was not gonna become the next Johnny Ive, because Apple is not gonna unify those positions again. Johnny Srouji might actually be in a position where he could unify both hardware groups, even though I would argue with Johnny Srouji at some point in the 5 to 10 years retiring, and John Turner's becoming CEO probably over the next 2 years or so, I would argue it actually makes a lot of sense to keep those divisions separate, because then you could take potentially both Johnny Srouji lieutenants and give one of them hardware tech and give one of them hardware engineering, right? Obviously, John Turner's will have some disciples of his own there, but honestly, the Johnny Srouji lieutenants, they're my absolute priority to keep at the company. I always mess up their names, so I'm not even gonna try. I would hate for the moment when, like, Johnny Srouji ultimately leaves, because he will at some point, and then, like, those two guys actually start to butt heads because they both want to become the next SVP. But then only one can be that. Now Apple could do whatever they want. They could create like a double head position there, but they would take that as an insult as well, right? And then both might leave. So, but let's actually get back to Johnny Srouji. So Apple builds a very wide set of technologies. He's very proud of all that across all of Apple's products. Together, we enable the best products in the world. I love my team and I love my job at Apple, and I don't plan on leaving anytime soon. I've already commented what anytime soon probably means, just the human recognition that at some point everything ends. I'm not saying that this is a guarantee that he will stay now longer for like the next 2 or 3 years, but as long as he stays during the probably somewhat tumultuous Tim Cook retirement, because just so much of Apple has been like on Tim's shoulders. Like, obviously not the engineering or whatever. I'm not actually expecting their products to get worse. I just think that the internal makeup of Apple, the executives and whatever, there's just a lot of people. And I think that, for example, Greg Joswiak will retire, right? And Deirdre O'Brien will retire. And that's not some big like swoop by Mark Gurman. This is just common sense. Deirdre has been at Apple for 35 years. Joss, by the next year, will be at Apple for 40 years. I believe he's now he's going to be the longest employed guy at Apple. I think he already is out of any executive, definitely. So Johnny Srouji, at least for now, is not on that list of people leaving. Obviously, we've covered all of the people, John J. Andrea, Ellen Dye, the people responsible for like Apple's legal stuff, the general counsel, Lisa Jackson, responsible for environmental policies. We've talked a lot about the restructuring that is going to be happening there, some executives' positions being unified in one place. some responsibilities, for example, of Lisa Jackson's office, going over also to the chief operating officer, Sabi Khan. So there's a lot happening at Apple. I hope that everyone is satisfied with it. For now, we don't actually hear that like Crack is dissatisfied or Sabi Khan is dissatisfied or obviously the next CEO, most likely like John Turner. So it seems like the cogs in the machine are still working, and this was the only cog where I was like, if he leaves, that could actually like be a very crucial cog that would be a little bit hard to replace without seeming desperate, right? Like you can replace a general counsel very quickly if you want to, and even then, by the way, that person is not leaving until the end of next year, right? So but if Johnny Srouji didn't just pack up and leave, right? And leave potentially for another company. And even then, like, I'm not even sure what would then be happening, right? Like, Johnny's expertise is so much married to Apple Silicon, is so married to, like, a-series chips, M-series chips, obviously ARM as an underlying technology, obviously reduced instruction set architectures. Like, could he go to Intel and work at x86? Most likely not really. I mean, could he go to Qualcomm? Sure, but that would be potentially a legal nightmare, right? Think about it, like Apple would just be like a hawk looking over his shoulder at any given second so that no intellectual property of his becomes the baseline for better Qualcomm processors. Like that would absolutely be completely unacceptable to them. So in fact, I think that just him moving there would already like Apple might have him murdered or whatever. Again, in a video game, it's a joke, but like you know what I mean, right? It would create a lot of panic. So at least for now, Johnny Srouji is not leaving. That's definitely something that we really covered extensively in the last video. So and now we have hopefully that last chapter of the story until he actually leaves, and hopefully he will leave in a very good place, just ready for regular retirement with a proper plan for how his team has to be structured once after he leaves, deciding whoever of his lieutenants gets to take over. So hopefully I'll be back to you with Johnny Srouji retire stories in 5 to 7, 8 years or something like that, and then we can actually celebrate his work at the company and not think to ourselves, oh my god, if he goes to Qualcomm, like, look, I appreciate competition, but that would be shitty competition, right? Like, because I do not believe that he has it in him to provide that much expertise to other ARM designers without potentially infringing on intellectual property of Apple at this point, because so much of his work has now become A-series, M-series, C-series, N-series. There's just way too much for him to even keep an eye on, like, wait, what did I create originally at Apple and what's like my new idea right now? I think that would be very difficult for him to manage. Now, let's move on to the stories that I've been teasing since the beginning, and let's start with the iPad, because as you guys know, right now, we just got the M5 iPad Pro, but that leaves, for example, the base iPad, the second version of the 10th generation iPad on the A16 chip. I still think that Apple should redesign some parts of that iPad. Like, for example, it needs support for Apple Pencil Pro. Like, that stupid USB-C Apple Pencil really needs to be, like, either it's just a cheap alternative, right? Let's say you just want a pencil for your kids, but even that, like, you get the Logitech crayon for that, actually. But yeah, that's definitely necessary. You can argue that it needs its own kind of like magic keyboard rather than the keyboard it currently has. I actually really like that keyboard solution. It's much more Surface-like, but honestly, out of all the stuff that Microsoft has done, like the Surface Hinge and the Surface keyboard have always been like my absolute favorites, and I have always tried to buy accessories that either replicate one of those things or both. Like, think about this, like the way that like the kickstand works here, right? I would argue it's worse than on the Surface because I need an extra case for it, and this is not full width the way that like a Surface kickstand is. But I definitely like that. And previously, I used to have Logitech keyboard accessories for my iPad before I started mostly working from my Mac in that regard, because I prefer that over the Magic Keyboard design, where the iPad is just not protected when I take it out of the case and stuff like that. Sorry, the Magic Keyboard, even though it should probably be called something like the Magic Keyboard case. And then the European prices are like $400 for the 13-inch iPad Pro's Magic Keyboard. So again, I'm very ranty today. I apologize. Obviously, I have a lot on my mind, and I kind of didn't realize that before I started streaming. But Macworld is now detailing a new leak for Apple's 2026 iPad strategy, bringing flagship level chips to more affordable models. So currently, again, we have a 10th generation base iPad with an A16 chip. We have an A17 based iPad mini. We have an M3 iPad Air and an M5 iPad Pro. That one is definitely not being updated until probably some point early 2027, given that iPad Pros are mostly on an 18-month cycle. In fact, most iPads are, but the iPads are not all aligned, so we get different iPads updated throughout different parts of the year. And this is now, according to Macworld, what we should be expecting next year. With 2026 just around the corner, there are already rumors about what to expect for the iPad lineup next year. In fact, we have already gotten some stories from the likes of Mark Gurman and Min-Chi Kuo about that. And Macworld now has strong evidence of what's coming. An internal Apple code document seen by Macworld. So this is why I'm saying we don't usually react to Macworld rumors, because they don't make them that often. But the last time we reacted to them, they actually had a similar thing for like a future iPad mini and stuff like that. So that's going to be interesting to see how maybe some of that not vibes too well. Like, for example, for the iPad mini, I believe it was their prediction that it would be getting an A18 chip. It should be noted, though, that that code stuff, that is subject to change, right? Just because it's in the code doesn't mean that Apple might not be working on different versions, like testing A18 on iPad mini, testing A19, thinking, oh, if it comes out early next year, then we may give it an A18 just to get rid of whatever supply we have for that chip. Or if it comes out very late in 2026, it makes more sense to give it an A19 to make it a little bit more desirable. And by that point, like the base iPhone might not be needing as many A19 chips, so we'll have, especially when it comes to binned chips, some overflow. So it's very interesting. So this code has revealed the company's plans for the 2026 iPad lineup, which includes an entry-level iPad with an A19 chip. Obviously, the only device right now with an A19 processor is Apple's base iPhone 17. The iPhone Air uses a binned A19 Pro with 5 GPU cores, and then the iPhone 17 Pro series uses an A19 Pro that's fully enabled with 6 GPU cores. The base iPhone has an A19 chip which has 5 GPU cores, but it's clocked genuinely a little lower. It has less cache than the Pro version, and it doesn't have, at least in software, some of the Pro functionality. ProRes, ProRAW, some of that camera stuff, even though its camera would definitely be capable of that. So those are some of the differentiations. I'm sure most of you are aware of those. A19 iPad. The entry-level iPad is expected to receive a significant spec bump. According to legitimate Apple code for an internal pre-release build of iOS 26 seen by Macworld. So this is a more up-to-date version. We don't know what that means for previous rumors that they have leaked about the iPad mini and stuff like that. So there's a new iPad under the code names J581, J582. There are obviously multiple versions because one will be the Wi-Fi only version. One will be the version with cellular. On the iPad Airs and Pros, it also notes that there are different sizes, so there will usually be 4 versions. And before the cellular versions were actually unified across the world, we got even crazier different versions, like 10 years in the past or so. That will be powered by the A19 chip, the same processor inside the current iPhone 17. Obviously, it's the same processor, at least foundationally, but it could be a processor that, for example, is binned differently, right? So if we have 5 GPU cores on the A19, on the iPhone 17, it could be, for example, that the base iPad, given that it's one of the cheapest products that Apple makes, certainly going to be one of the cheapest products with that kind of processor, unless Apple eventually makes like an Apple TV with it. Like I could conceivably see that iPad using a 4 GPU core version of that, or maybe even where one of the E-cores is disabled or something like that. So basically, the yields are very good for 3 nanometer. They're very good for N3P, but there will always be chips that are a little defective. Sometimes the defect makes the chip completely unusable. Sometimes it just means you have to disable a CPU core, a GPU core, a little bit of cache, right? And obviously, with a cheaper iPad, that presents an opportunity to use such a chip, because whatever you do with an A19 chip, you're probably going to end up with something more powerful than the A16 chip. Don't forget, the A16 chip here is not even a 3 nanometer class chip. It's an N4P chip. Depends a little bit on the exact node denomination. So definitely a big upgrade. Usually iPads jump 2 processor classes, so that's processor generations. So typically we would expect A16 to be upgraded to A18, but seemingly Apple has enough A19 supply, maybe enough A19 bins to justify using that. The 11th generation iPad has an A16 chip, plenty powerful for everyday tasks, does not have Apple Intelligence. A19 is about 50% faster than A16 and significantly more faster than that when it comes to GPU. Obviously, it also comes after the introduction of hardware accelerated ray tracing, mesh shading, and dynamic cache, which were all introduced on the A17 generation. And obviously, subsequently from that, we've gotten second generation ray tracing, and it's third generation ray tracing, and second generation dynamic caching. So a lot of stuff has been updated since then. The A19 also has more RAM. That being said, RAM is not technically married to one specific chip. Now, it would be very surprising if Apple gave that A19 chip only 6 gigs of RAM. I do think it's likely that an A19 chip will always come with at least 8 gigabytes, but it does not necessarily have to be. Like, while the RAM is packaged, like obviously Apple can modify that package. The only real difference is that I don't actually think that 8500 mega transfers per second memory, which is what the A19 uses, actually exist in 6 gigabyte packages for a 64-bit bus processor. So I actually think that it just will make sense for Apple to use whatever RAM they also use for the iPhone 17, and then use whatever chips might be slightly binned. It makes it better for multitasking and AI-based features. Obviously, with the memory also comes faster memory. The A16, for example, uses 6400 mega transfers per second memory. This would be 1/3 faster at 8533. So that is going to give more bandwidth for stuff like Apple Intelligence, for better games from the App Store and things like that. This will bring the iPad closer to the premium models and future-proof it for upcoming AI features. The new entry-level iPad model is also expected to feature Apple's N1 wireless chip, which was introduced with iPhone 17 lineup. I also wouldn't be surprised if it got the C1, or more likely even the C1X modem as an upgrade, or as an optional upgrade for the cellular model, because don't forget, the iPad Pro already gives you an option to upgrade to a C1X. And obviously, a C1X modem is much cheaper for Apple to use than a modem from Qualcomm. And most likely, they don't even have that many orders left for Qualcomm modem. So while technically, could it use like an X71 modem like on the iPhone 16 series or an X80 modem like on the iPhone 17 Pros? Sure. But I think that N1 is pretty much shoehorned, pretty much a guarantee here, like Wi-Fi 7 versus a Wi-Fi 6 chip. So this isn't just Wi-Fi 6E to Wi-Fi 7. This is Wi-Fi 6 to Wi-Fi 7. This will be significantly faster. Like I know some people have complained that the N1, for example, does not support 320 megahertz Wi-Fi 7 support, but it's still way faster than whatever is on the base iPad, or whatever is on the current Apple TV, or whatever is on the current HomePods. So on those devices, it's going to be a very, very nice modem. And then on future iPhones, I actually think we might not just get an N2 down the road, but like an N2X to differentiate the products that don't just have Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 6, threads, and all that stuff, but actually have higher performing version of those. We already have that on the C lineup, right? The iPhone 16e launched with the C1, but then subsequently the iPhone Air got the C1X, and the current M5 iPad Pro has a C1X. So Apple has already proven that they are willing to do like either as a mid-gen upgrade an X chip or just as a more premium version. If you remember in the past, before we got M series processors, we had AX processors from Apple, which were basically bigger versions of the current generation A series chip for iPhone, but for iPad. So I could see some of that differentiation happening with N1, N series, C series as well. In terms of design, displays, and cameras, everything will likely remain the same. Again, that it could be a reasonable speculation, but I would argue there's no guarantee for that. There are some things that Apple could change without making the iPad, the base iPad, like cannibalize the iPad Air or something like that. Like if they gave it Apple Pencil Pro support and redesigned that magnet on top to support charging for the Apple Pencil and stuff like that, which obviously is possible, we know, because that's what Apple does already on all the other iPads. I think that wouldn't hurt it. That technically could leave the iPad still looking the same mostly, and obviously it could still have like the same main display, which is non-laminated. That's a big part of how Apple keeps production costs, repair costs much lower for the base iPad. But yeah, that's one thing that I believe could change. Then there is the M4 iPad Air, another spec bump, just jumping from M3 to M4, similar to how the iPad Pro jumped from M4 to M5. Also makes sense. Use bint M series chips for the Air. Obviously, right now with the huge changes to iPadOS 26, there's a lot of reason for people to be currently updating their older iPads. Like a lot of older iPads actually support the new multitasking and whatever on iPadOS 26. But I think that for the smoothest experience, you probably would want to upgrade to something that's relatively new. So M4 is definitely a decent chunk faster than M3, especially when it comes to the CPU. M5 then gives a nice boost to the GPU. So there's a lot. Obviously, if you want the absolute best, you buy it on the iPad Pro, which also features better cooling. For example, for the M6 iPad Pro, we are rumored to be getting actually a vapor chamber inside, similar to what the iPhone 17 Pro has gotten. So there's a lot of stuff that already is available on iPads and will become available in the future. But beyond that, obviously, the base versions keep getting better as well. But for like the best screen and stuff like that, that's still something where Apple definitely pushes you upwards. Like the iPhone 17 is the first base level iPhone to get ProMotion, and that's obviously years and years after the iPhone 13 Pros gotten ProMotion in the first place. So iPads have gotten promotion, for example, in 2017, even longer than iPhones, but we still only have promotion on Pro iPads. So that would definitely be something that could also make future iPad Air and iPad Mini much more attractive. We also hear rumors about OLED screens for those devices. Ironically, though, the rumor we have gotten for the iPad Mini is that it's getting OLED, but without promotion, so you'll kind of have to pick and choose. So it's confusing, but it's confusing simply because there are price differentiations. If you just want the very best, don't be confused. Buy whatever is the most expensive. Under the code names J707, 8, J737, and 38, the new iPad Air likely won't have any major design changes and is expected to keep the same display and camera specs as the current generation. Camera specs is one thing where I've been getting a little bit more disappointed with iPad. Not that I take too many pictures with my iPad, but I think the iPad, especially Air and Pro, could really get the same main camera as, for example, the iPhone 16e has. That's not a very large sensor. Sure, it's a lot larger than what we have right now, but it would finally support, after all those years, like newer feature. I say newer features even though they have been around since the iPhone 11 days, like night mode on iPad, right? And again, not trying to say that these are and obviously every iPhone now has 48 megapixel cameras. There's no iPad that has that, so that would definitely be something that Apple could do. But I don't know why they bring this up, like if they're just saying, oh, that's expected, like, because we definitely could be getting something, for example, like the front-facing camera of the iPhone 17 generation, right? That could definitely be a big hit on the iPad. So I don't know if they truly know that it's not happening or it's just their speculation, because just from those numbers, they could not be able to make that conclusion. Just like the new entry-level iPad, the M4 iPad Air will also feature Apple's custom N1 wireless chip. Makes a lot of sense. Again, that's already happening with the iPad Pro. There will be a new iPad Pro version, but that's very likely a 2027 release, very likely then being upgraded to a 2nm M6 processor. By that time, we might have C3 chips and 2 or N2X chips, so there's plenty room for Apple to then differentiate the iPad Pro from those lower-level iPads. According to Macworld sources, both the A19 iPad and the M4 iPad Air are set to launch sometime next year. So this, and according to Gurman, who has commented on these products, just not explicitly on like what chips they would be using, these are early 2026 products. So supposedly iPad Mini is actually a late 2026 product, but then that would actually be getting an OLED screen, right? To really differentiate it, to give it some unique selling points. And then over time, the iPad Air would be getting basically the same OLED screen. Again, supposedly LTPS, supposedly no variable refresh rate, supposedly no higher refresh rate, just OLED, which definitely will be in many ways better than the 60 Hertz LCDs we have right now, would be more efficient, would actually be a thinner panel. Would allow for much better contrast, much better pixel response times, but unfortunately no promotion. So that seems like the going to release cycle for next year that's being rumored. So base iPad and M4 iPad Air, which obviously includes the 11 and 13-inch versions, somewhat in the first half, and then sometime in the second half, the iPad Mini. The exact details on when each product launches, it probably depends on just Apple's whims and their ability to sell out of inventory for the current 10th generation iPad and for the current M3 iPad Air. So we're gonna talk about it obviously once we get to that point in time. But speaking of devices that get an A19 chip, because that's definitely not something I expected to be saying for this specific device. It's the Apple Studio Display 2 also is being leaked in the same way, like that leak we've discussed before, by Macworld. And according to that leak, it's getting ProMotion, HDR, and an A19 chip. Just for context, the Apple Studio Display obviously features things like a camera and speakers. Apple is pretty generous to give devices with a camera pretty good big chips. Like, for example, the current generation Apple Studio Display has an A13 processor, which you could argue like, oh, that's an older chip by this point, but it's also very overpowered. For like, no standalone monitor has a chip of that class inside, and we don't know how much it's been down. Apple might just be using it for stuff like the image signal processor on the chip, right? To just manage stuff like the camera, and then a little bit of performance for like the audio output and whatever. But that's not really that complicated, right? An A19 chip is definitely very, very much overkill. I suspect that it would then come with a very decent camera upgrade, because at least according to actual users of the current Studio Display first generation, that camera has been a little bit of a disappointment. People have actually partially blamed the older image signal processor on the A13 processor on that camera being a little bit more grainy and stuff like that than people expect. So if Apple, for example, uses maybe the camera from the iPhone 17 series, right? That squared 1 by 2.5 inch sensor, 24 megapixels. They could definitely think, oh, we have A19 chips that are like maybe just a few 100,000 of those, right? But they're really beat up. They have like 1 P core disabled and 2 E cores, so they're basically unusable in any kind of iPhone or whatever, even maybe not for an iPad. So we can just use those that still have an image signal processor, right? And then use that for the best camera ever on a display or something like that. Obviously, that's a bit more speculation for me, but that's how I could see Apple justifying using a pretty expensive and a pretty new chip that might be still in relatively short supply, like the A19 on something like a Studio Display. So we've been hearing rumors about a potential new generation of Apple of Studio Display for a while. In fact, Pro Display XDR just turned 6 years old. The Studio Display, by the time it launched, it was a very nice looking product. Obviously, very few monitors out there look and feel as nice as the Studio Display. But think about it. It's just a standard 60 hertz 5K, which is very nice, but there's no advanced HDR capabilities. There's no zone lighting with mini LED. There's definitely no OLED. There's definitely no variable refresh rate. So it definitely was basically just an iMac panel put into an external monitor, and surprisingly expensive for that as well. So yeah, we've heard about that one for years. Now, supposedly, it's finally time for that to change. Macworld has seen evidence of a new Studio Display with new features that will bring several notable upgrades. Again, this is legitimate Apple code for an internal pre-release build of iOS 26, which is probably what this device would be running. It's like a fork of iOS because, well, iOS is optimized for A-series chips, and even the current Studio Display features an A-series processor, the A13. This supposedly would come with an A19, which is quite insane. That display is internally identified as J527. This codename had previously been associated with a second-generation Studio Display, as leaked by Bloomberg's Mark Gurman. So at least we have some synergy here when it comes to leaks coming from all kinds of different sources. With the existence of an imminent Studio Display upgrade, while the existence is no surprise, we now finally have more details. Reference in the code clearly showed that this new Studio Display has a variable refresh rate that go up to 120 hertz. Man, this website really insists on me playing their fucking podcast. And why is it also loading without any option to like just not do it or just to click it frick away. Jesus, that's stupid. No wonder they want me to turn off my ad blocker before I turn their videos on, because I think this shit might actually be flagged as an ad. And obviously, their other ads are quite intrusive and quite bad. Oh, God. But let's focus on the positives. Supposedly the studio display has a variable refresh rate that go up to 120 hertz. That's basically the definition for Apple for ProMotion, that combination of higher refresh rates than 60, or which for Apple basically universally means 120. Thus far, they have not launched like a 90 hertz product or anything like that. And that high refresh rate needs to be variable to preserve energy, to adapt to different kinds of content on the screen, to actually make some stuff smoother without higher refresh rates. So, for example, 24 FPS movies can actually be displayed in a 48 hertz mode, which would actually give you just give you 2 refreshes per frame of that video, that movie. That looks way smoother than displaying a 24 hertz 24 FPS movie on a 60 hertz display. So definitely here you feel the advantages of both higher and variable refresh rates, which obviously would match the capabilities that we have on the MacBook Pros, the iPad Pro as well, obviously the iPhone 17, iPhone Air, iPhone 17 Pro. The current Studio Display and the current Pro Display XDR are all limited to 60 hertz, as is the 24-inch iMac that Apple offers. So there's definitely some room to improve. Furthermore, the code references a J527 monitor that also supports both SDR and HDR modes, an upgrade from the current SDR-only model. Now, this is interesting because technically a 600 nits LCD screen could be labeled, at least conceivably, as HDR. That's not really something that Apple does, at least not from my experience. So Apple definitely associates HDR, similar to how ProMotion means something for them. HDR, or as they call it, XDR, for them is associated with a level of brightness control across different areas on that screen. On mini LED screens, that, for example, comes with zone control. The Pro Display XDR has over 5,000 zones. And for example, the mini LED on 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, that comes with over 2,000 zones, right? And then obviously when you look at OLED screens, where you can get pixel level brightness control, that is even finer, more granular control. It's much more susceptible to issues such as blooming. That's where you might have a bright object amidst a black background, and that black background suddenly stops being black because the entire zone has to be activated. That looks better the smaller the zone, and if you can make that zone pixel level small, that obviously will give you the best result. We don't know yet what kind of technology Apple is eyeing for that display. I mean, I could see them going somewhat cheap and using basically a trimmed down version of the Pro Display XDR, which is still fairly competitive in the PC field. Like if we look at 530 or so zones on the Pro Display XDR at 32 inches of size, I could see them definitely having over 400 zones on a 27-inch monitor. I definitely would prefer the extreme density that we have on iPad, that we had on iPad Pro, that we currently have on MacBook Pro. But I'm not sure how invested Apple is still in mini LED. They might just want to get it over with, give this device mini LED, give this device ProMotion, and then wait until OLED and eventually even tandem OLED becomes good and cheap enough on large monitors that it's worth implementing. Like a Pro Display XDR2, for example, like in my opinion, that doesn't need like just a higher density mini LED grid. It actually needs tandem OLED. At least if Apple actually wants to keep selling it for $5,000-6,000, maybe even increase the price a little bit. But obviously, the Studio Display is targeting under $2,000. It's definitely a very different kind of product. So the fact that it's targeting an HDR mode or will support an HDR mode suggests that Apple might be switching from a traditional LCD panel to one with a mini LED background, or again some form of OLED. Currently, the LCD on the Studio Display maxes out at 600 nits. Obviously without HDR because it has no zone control for brightness. In contrast, the mini LED display in the latest MacBook Pro reaches 1000 nits of sustained brightness. That's for SDR, and 1600 nits for HDR content. So that's on one part of the screen. Like let's say you have like a blooming effect, and I don't mean like blooming as in the issue on the display. I mean like you have like an explosion on the screen or a rising sun or whatever, and that can be as bright as 1600 nits. In fact, a lot of TVs on a small area of their screen these days even allow like 4000 nits or something like that. That's how you get some Android phones these days that will advertise like 5000 nits of brightness, but it's in HDR mode on like a 1 to 2% window of the entire screen. It has nothing to do with all screen brightness or actual usability and legibility in bright lighting scenarios. So however you want to treat it, this Apple definitely respects the artistic intent of HDR a lot more than some of these other companies. If Apple really goes with these leaked specs, the next Studio Display will be a huge step up in image quality compared to the current model. And supposedly, there's another big upgrade there, which is an A19 chip inside. And there is a small but interesting detail is that the new Studio Display will reportedly be powered by the A19 processor, while the current one has the A13 inside. Although Studio Display lacks smart features such as built-in apps, it uses its chip to handle webcam image processing and spatial audio, which again in A19 is quite overpowered for, but Apple might just be using such a beat up version of that chip that they're just using primarily its image signal processor and maybe one of its cores for audio and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit for stuff like security, but yeah, that's all really comes to my mind. Apple is targeting the launch of the new Studio Display sometime in 2026, possibly alongside a new M5 Mac Studio. Stay tuned to Macworld for more details. That's also interesting. That's also something that Mark Gurman has brought up in the past. We're not just getting M5 Pro and Max MacBook Pros next year, an M5 MacBook Air, which obviously is plenty to justify launching this product already. But if you remember, actually, the initial launch of the first generation Studio Display, the current one we have right now, that one actually launched alongside the first generation of Mac Studio. That's why they both get that Studio branding, right? They're very much connected to. I feel like in their dreams, Apple thought that Mac Pro users would be using the Pro Display XDR, basically, like, you know, that like Jurassic Park meme, like we spared no expense. Like basically, look, if you're buying the Pro Display XDR, you're just going to buy a Mac Pro just because, oh, both are Pro. And if you are a little bit cheaper than that, but still a relatively high-level customer or a prosumer, as they might be called, you might get a Studio product, right? A Mac Studio, a Studio Display, and I think that Apple still hangs on to that branding, but obviously that we have seen that the Mac Studio has far outsold the Mac Pro. This is why the Mac Studio is now getting more upgrades than the Mac Pro. The current Mac Pro is limited to the M2 Ultra processor. There's absolutely no reason to buy that because you can buy an M4 Max or an M3 Ultra Mac Studio, right? And obviously next year we're supposedly getting an M5 Max and an M5 Ultra Mac Studio. If Apple does not dramatically increase the prices on those products, though even a 10% increase would probably still make them really high value at the time of exploding RAM and storage costs on the PC side, which finally is starting to make Apple's ridiculous RAM upgrade prices look not yet reasonable, but may give it another 2 or 3 months. Maybe during Christmas season, people will buy out the last available DDR5 memory and stuff like that, and maybe that will actually make Apple's LPDDR5X RAM pricing look reasonable. But yeah, so it would make sense that the Studio Display would arrive together with a new Mac Studio. I really hope that Apple also upgrades the Mac Pro, or finally commits to decommissioning it, forgetting it, because we can argue about, like, for example, I don't share the belief that the iPad lineup is confusing. I think it mainly comes down to choices of size and cost, and honestly, like, you should be able to make that decision. On the Mac side, where the Mac Pro is just so ridiculously outpaced technologically by a cheaper product, and you could argue, well, but the Mac Pro offers like upgradability because it has PCIe slots. But what exactly am I upgrading? I cannot upgrade the RAM. Storage, sure, I can add a big PCIe converter that accepts several NVMe drives, but why really, if I can just use a NAS setup with a Thunderbolt 5 based Mac Studio at this point? Right? Like, I cannot change its GPU, I cannot change its CPU. What exactly am I upgrading on the Mac Pro that I need it to be $3,000 more expensive than a Mac with an M2 Ultra chip than the M3 Ultra Mac Studio? So you get less performance across CPU, GPU, especially on the GPU. You don't even get like crucial new features that, let's say you only edit videos, right? But even then, the video encoders get upgraded. But then you think about, let's say you do a little bit of 3D rendering on the side. Now you don't have hardware accelerated ray tracing or mesh shading and stuff like that. On a $3,000 more expensive Mac Pro. So let's see what happens with that. At least it seems like the future of the Studio Display and the Mac Studio are definitely rosy. Like, sure, I would have loved the Studio Display to have gotten an upgrade sooner. I definitely would like some of the pricing on the Studio Display to be more reasonable. Like, when I especially look at the pricing for like their stand, where you pay like, what, $400 extra for the best stand. No, don't switch to German. The German prices are even more ridiculous. So there are the displays, 2 displays, none of them new, not even close. Let's buy it. I believe it's $15.99 as a base price. That's already way too high. Nano texture glass, you're paying $300 more. I do think it should be more in the $200 range. And then, yeah, you got a tilt adjustable stand, and then you get a tilt and height adjustable stand. Like, again, like, I work with dual monitors at work. Like, height adjustment is in everything. Tilt adjustment is actually not in everything. Like, it is kind of, but it's very cheap, and it almost feels like you're breaking the monitor every time you're pulling it on the chin a little bit forward and backwards. But height adjustment is just on every monitor, and it works reasonably well enough. Maybe it's not as nice of a mechanism as this, but again, it, like, for $400 extra, I can actually buy a completely separate, like, 1440p monitor. I can buy a 1080p high refresh rate monitor for that money, right? And when I look at, obviously, just the price of this with a Visa mount adapter, now for $1,600, I can get a really, really nice, like, gaming monitor that's 4K, 120, or even at this point, 165 hertz, OLED, and that has like variable refresh rate technologies, all that stuff. Sure, that means it, and it has a great stand with it already, right? So again, these prices, some of it might just make sense because maybe you just want the perfect setup where every technology works together. But at the very least, this needed 120 hertz like 2 or 3 years ago, right? For this kind of money, because it's not that much more expensive for Apple to implement. So that's my 2 cents here. I'm definitely not an Apple apologist where I'll just defend whatever they make at however much they price it at. But this is currently the position. If they don't change the prices at all, and this is actually a decent mini LED promotion panel, I could just tell people buy it with the Visa mount adapter, because it always sucks to tell them buy a $1,600 monitor and then put some books underneath it like what I do with my MacBook Pro before I set it into position for the stream. But yeah, so to me, like a big part of the value would be like half that price. It would still be overpriced because in my opinion it should be standard. Or honestly, if you just want to bring average sales price of this product up, just make it $1,800 with a stand, with the new with a stand that can do everything, right? I don't know how many people buy this, to be honest. And then maybe, or make it $2,000, right? With a tilt and height adjustable stand, and $1,800 for the version with a Visa mount adapter. And I think you would be fine, to be quite honest, right? It would suggest that the stand is $200, but we know it would basically be in the package made a little bit cheaper. But yeah, just asking for like, it's not like this is a stand, like $400 more versus stand less. Like, what is this stand supposed to be worth? Nothing. So again, I'm pretty ranty today. I actually don't think I have the time anymore to really react to MKBHD's latest video, but I might do that in a future stream. To be quite honest, it's not that interesting. I might do that by the time, like, maybe Mr. Who's the Boss does his end of the year video where he ranks the best of phones. Let me see. Oh, he already made that video and it came out 4 hours ago. You know what? Then I might actually be doing that stream on the weekend. I might be comparing Mr. Who's the Boss's video and MKBHD's latest video. So I had even pre-downloaded it for MKBHD. And when I look at Mr. Who's the Boss, that video came out like 4 hours ago, but I do have to get a little bit of sleep. The stream is already actually turning a little bit longer than I expected, but I liked most of the choices for MKBHD. Wasn't too fond of the iPhone 16e being necessarily the bust of the year. Not because actually I'm a big fan of the iPhone 16e. You guys know that I think it's not worth $600. But I think the bust of the year is the Nothing Phone 3, right? That terrible design and ridiculously overpriced in the PC space for its money. I'm pretty sure he will, as always, be more lenient towards like Vivo phones and stuff like that. He likes his huge batteries, especially on phones. God, these people have no sense of taste. Like, look, I know it's like a jokey, but you can get something glittering that still looks good. He's an attractive looking man. Like, he does not need to look like a joke for this. That being said, I'm pretty much done for today. Thank you to anyone who joined. I will try to, again, provide more regularly scheduled programs. So hopefully I'll be back on like Saturday. Who knows if I can make the time tomorrow. I'll try to stream tomorrow. And I would then compare MKBHD's and Mr. Who's the Boss's comparisons. Maybe at that point we could just look at Mr. Who's the Boss's video, which will be newer at that point, because I think most people know by now which devices won MKBHD's video. That being said, as always, I'm open to suggestions to whatever else I should be reacting to and streaming about. As always, you can connect with me through my Discord. You'll find the link to that in the description of this channel. Please like the video, share it out with anybody who you think might enjoy it. Comment live. Comment whenever I'm live with super chats and super stickers, but also just comment afterwards for the algorithm. And beyond all that, you can also become a channel member right here on YouTube. Do all that YouTube jazz that I already mentioned in the beginning of the video. Again, this is a hobby, so I'm not gonna feel forced to just stream every day or something like that, but I do enjoy this, and the more people join, the more enjoyable it is. So if that's a motivation for you to watch more live or comment more, then hopefully that works, because it definitely works for me. And beyond all that, I'll just see you next time. Thank you for tuning in. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.